There is a moment that most people do not see coming. You have spent decades doing what you were supposed to do. You worked. You contributed to your retirement account every paycheck, year after year, watching the number slowly rise. You resisted the temptation to touch it during the bad years, the lean years, the years when the car broke down or the roof needed repair and the money was sitting right there. You left it alone. You let it grow. And then one day, the regular income stops. The direct deposit that arrived every 2 weeks. The one that told you, quietly and without ceremony, that you were still a working person with a place in the economy. That deposit does not come anymore. You are retired now. This was the plan. This is what you worked for. And then you check your bank account a few weeks later and you notice something that your body registers before your mind does. The number is smaller, not by much, but smaller. And the next month it is smaller again. And instead of the relief and the ease you expected to feel, instead of the lightness of finally having arrived at the life you were building toward, you feel something else. You feel anxious, not in a dramatic way, not in the way of a crisis or a diagnosis. It is quieter than that. It is the low, background feeling of something being slightly wrong, of a rule being broken, of something moving in a direction it should not be moving. You know, intellectually, that this is exactly what the money is for. You know that drawing down savings is the whole point. You have perhaps read about sustainable withdrawal rates, or spoken to a financial advisor who told you that your account can sustain you for decades at your current spending rate. You have done the math. The math is fine. And yet the number keeps going down, and something in you keeps resisting it. This experience is not unusual. It is, in fact, one of the most common unspoken anxieties of retirement, and one of the least prepared for transitions in modern adult life. Most people spend decades learning to save. Almost no one teaches them how to spend. The financial system that guided them through 40 years of accumulation has almost nothing useful to say about the 40 years of drawdown that follow. There is a word for this phase of financial life, a technical word that financial planners use quietly among themselves. Decumulation. The organized, intentional process of spending down what was built. It is the mirror image of accumulation, and it is the phase for which almost no one receives any real preparation. The industry that grew up around retirement savings is very good at helping people get to the destination. It is remarkably poor at helping them live there. So the question we need to ask today is not whether you should be spending your savings. You should. That is what they exist for. The question is deeper than that. Why does spending what you saved feel so wrong? Where does that feeling come from? And what does it reveal about the relationship between money and identity, between security and fear, and between the life you built and the life you are now living? These are not small questions. They touch something central to how modern retirement actually works, and how millions of people find themselves, in the years they were supposed to be finally free, still unable to fully let go. Today, we are going to look at all of this, slowly, without judgment, because this particular kind of anxiety deserves more attention than it gets. And because understanding it, really understanding where it comes from and what it costs, is the first step towards something genuinely valuable. The ability to use what you built without guilt, without fear, and without the strange poverty of a person who saved their whole life and then spent it watching a number instead of living one. To understand why spending retirement savings feels so difficult, you need to understand what retirement used to look like, and what was quietly dismantled to create the system that exists today. For most of the 20th century, the standard retirement in the United States, Canada, and much of the Western world was built around a simple and psychologically elegant structure. You worked for an employer for a certain number of years. When you retired, that employer paid you a monthly income for the rest of your life. Sometimes the government contributed through a public pension. Sometimes a union had negotiated the terms. But the basic logic was the same. Retirement income arrived like a paycheck. It came in every month whether you thought about it or not, whether the stock market went up or down, whether you were anxious or calm or somewhere in between. This was called a defined benefit pension. And its great psychological gift, one that almost no one talks about when they mourn its loss, was that it eliminated the problem of decumulation entirely. You never had to watch a savings account go down. You never had to decide how much to withdraw, when to withdraw, whether you were withdrawing too fast or too slow, whether there would be enough left at the end. The math was handled. The income was guaranteed. The anxiety of the drawdown simply did not exist as it exists today, because there was no drawdown. There was just income, monthly, reliable, and not contingent on your ability to make the right decisions about a portfolio you spent 4 decades carefully building. There were problems with the pension system. Employers could mismanage funds. Workers who changed jobs frequently accumulated smaller benefits. Some pension systems were underfunded. The system was not perfect, and it is not the purpose of this video to idealize it. But it is worth pausing on that psychological gift, because it explains a great deal about why modern retirees experience a kind of anxiety that their parents and grandparents, by and large, did not. This system began to change in the late 1970s. The Revenue Act of 1978 contained a small provision, Section 401(k), that allowed employees to defer a portion of their salary into a tax-advantaged account. The provision was originally written for a very specific executive compensation arrangement. Nobody designed it to replace the pension system. It was a footnote in a tax bill, not a policy vision. But within a few years, companies had recognized what it offered them: a way to shift the financial burden of retirement from the employer's balance sheet to the employee's paycheck. Through the 1980s and 1990s, company after company froze or terminated its defined benefit pension plan and replaced it with a 401(k) option. The shift happened gradually enough that many people did not fully understand what had changed. They were told they now had a retirement account. They were told to contribute, to invest wisely, to let compound interest do its work over time. The language was optimistic. The brochures were full of charts showing wealth growing over decades. What the brochures did not include was a chapter on what to do when the growing was done. There was no section titled, "How to Spend This." There was no guided transition from accumulation to distribution. There was no psychological preparation for the moment when you would open that account and begin taking money out instead of putting money in. This is not a small omission. It is a structural gap at the heart of the modern retirement system. And the gap exists, in part, because the financial industry that grew up around 401(k) plans was never primarily in the business of helping people spend. It was in the business of growing assets under management. The incentive structure of the entire industry pointed toward accumulation, toward keeping the number going up, not toward the orderly and confident spending down of what had been built. So an entire generation of workers was trained, over decades, in the discipline and virtue of saving. They were rewarded for it, not just financially but psychologically. Watching the number grow felt good. It felt like progress. It felt like safety. It became, for many people, a source of self-definition, the visible proof that they had been responsible, careful, and forward-thinking adults in a world that rewarded those qualities. And then they retired. And nobody told them what to do next. The result is a generation of people who are extraordinarily good at one half of the financial task, and almost entirely unprepared for the other. They saved. They accumulated. They watched the number rise for decades. And now they are standing at the top of that long climb with a very large account and a very deep reluctance to touch it. That reluctance did not come from nowhere. It was built by the system. And understanding how it was built is the beginning of understanding why it persists even when the numbers say it no longer needs to. There is a body of research, quiet, not often featured in financial media, that documents something surprising about retirees with adequate savings. Many of them consistently underspend. Not because they are irresponsible, not because they miscalculated, but because something in them cannot let go. Studies by several major financial institutions have found that retirees with significant savings often spend at rates far below what their accounts could comfortably sustain. Some draw only from the income their investments generate, interest, dividends, while the principal sits largely untouched, accumulating year after year as though the goal of retirement is still to make the number grow. Some die with more money than they expected, sometimes substantially more, and their heirs are left with a strange mixture of gratitude and unease. The feeling that a life was lived more carefully than it needed to be. Among those who underspend, researchers have identified several consistent patterns. One is the healthcare fear. And this fear is not irrational. Medical costs in the United States are genuinely significant, and long-term care, the kind of sustained daily assistance that some people eventually require, can cost amounts that would shock anyone who has not looked at the numbers recently. The fear of one catastrophic diagnosis draining a savings account in a matter of months is not a paranoid fantasy. It has happened to real people. It continues to happen, but the healthcare fear, legitimate as it is, often becomes something more than a reasonable precaution. It becomes a kind of all-purpose reason not to spend, ever, on anything. A trip becomes money I might need for a hospital bill. A home renovation becomes money I might need for a care facility. A nice dinner, a gift, a small luxury, all of it gets filtered through the same question. But what if I need that money later? And since later is always uncertain, and the need is always possible, the spending almost never happens. The fear, which started as a rational calculation about healthcare risk, has quietly expanded to cover all of life. There is also the inheritance dimension. Many people who have children or grandchildren feel, at some level, that the money in their retirement account is not fully theirs. It is being held in trust. It is the cushion that will help their children if something goes wrong, or the gift that will make their grandchildren's lives easier after they are gone. To spend it on themselves, freely, on pleasure, on experience, on the things that bring them joy, can feel like a kind of taking. Like drawing from a fund that belongs to the next generation, not to the person who built it. This feeling is powerful, and it is almost never spoken out loud. People carry it privately, like a rule they never agreed to but somehow feel obligated to follow. They deny themselves things not out of hardship but out of a quiet, unexamined sense that the money belongs to the future, not to the present. And what does this actually cost them? It costs them the trip they kept saying they would take when they had more time, when the grandchildren were a little older, when the moment felt right. It costs them the class, the project, the experience, the thing they spent 40 years promising themselves they would eventually do. It costs them the spontaneous generosity, picking up the check, buying the gift, helping the friend who needs a hand right now, because they are always conserving, always protecting, always watching the number with a vigilance that made complete sense during the saving years but no longer serves the life they're actually living. People postpone living with great discipline and good intentions, until the body begins to have opinions about what it can still do. The trip to the place they always wanted to see eventually requires knees that are no longer willing partners. The long drive becomes a conversation with eyesight that has its own timeline. The thing they plan to do at 60 is attempted at 75 with a body that has become a different kind of companion. This is not a failure of planning. It is not irresponsibility. It is the human cost of an anxiety that was never identified, never named, and therefore never addressed. And there is one more layer, one that carries its own quiet weight. There are people who die with more money in their accounts than they ever imagined they would. Their estates are settled, their children are grateful and perhaps a little surprised. And somewhere in that accounting is the shadow of a question that cannot quite be asked. What did they not do? What did they not enjoy? What mornings did they not spend freely? What evenings did they not allow themselves, while the account sat growing because the fear of needing it later was always louder than the knowledge of what was available now? This is what underspending actually costs. Not in dollars, in life. To understand why this anxiety is so persistent and so resistant to reason, we need to look at what money meant for the decades before retirement, and why that meaning does not simply update itself when circumstances change. For most working adults, money is not just money. It is the measurable record of effort and time. Every dollar in a savings account represents something real, a piece of work, an hour of the morning, a piece of a year, a decision to defer something now in order to have something later. The savings account is, in a very real sense, compressed time. It is all the mornings and the decisions and the discipline, stored and waiting. When you earn a paycheck, you feel a relatively clear and immediate relationship between your work and your compensation. But when you spend from savings, you are spending what took decades to build. You are using compressed time. And that feels different. It feels heavier. It feels, to some part of the nervous system, irreplaceable, because it is. The time that built those savings is genuinely gone. You cannot go back and rebuild them in the same way you could rebuild an ordinary monthly expense. This is one reason the number feels so loaded. It is not abstract. It is the visible account of a life of effort. And then there is the identity dimension. For most of a working adult's life, two things defined who they were: their work and their financial responsibility. Work gave them a role, a daily structure, a social identity. And their financial discipline, their ability to save, to defer, to resist spending and keep building, gave them a character. It told them, and told others, that they were the kind of person who thinks about the future, who takes care of their family, who does not need to be rescued. Retirement takes away the work. That transition is difficult enough, and it has been discussed at length. But what is discussed far less is that retirement also asks people to surrender the financial identity. The person who saved is now being asked to spend. The virtue that defined them, the discipline, the restraint, the long view thinking, is suddenly the thing standing between them and the life that saving was supposed to make possible. It asks for a kind of internal permission that was never explicitly granted. There is another layer, quieter and less often admitted. Spending down a retirement account is, at some level, a confrontation with mortality. Not in a dramatic way, not the stark confrontation of a diagnosis or a sudden emergency, but a softer, more gradual one. Every withdrawal is a small reminder that time is finite, that the reservoir is not infinite, that the account and the life it supports are both headed, eventually, toward zero. This is not a morbid thought. It is simply true. But for many people, keeping the account large, keeping the number impressive, keeping the cushion substantial, functions as a way of not quite confronting that truth. The large number says, there is still a lot left. There is still a lot of time. The future is still long. And the human mind, which has a deep preference for not looking directly at its own finitude, can find this comforting in ways that are hard to explain rationally. Meanwhile, the financial institutions that hold this money have their own relationship to it, one that is worth examining honestly, without cynicism but with clear eyes. A wealth management firm, an investment company, a brokerage that administers a retirement account earns its fees as a percentage of assets under management. The more money that stays in the account, the more the firm earns. A client who aggressively draws down their account is, from the firm's perspective, a shrinking source of revenue. This does not mean that financial advisors are dishonest or that they actively discourage spending. Most of them are professionals doing their best. But the incentive structure of the entire industry is oriented toward keeping assets in accounts, and toward framing conservation as virtue and spending as risk. The language of financial planning reflects this orientation over and over. Terms like wealth preservation, protecting your principal, making your money last, all of these frame money in terms of protection and longevity, not use and enjoyment. The question they are implicitly answering is always, how do we keep the number from going down? Rather than, what is the wisest, most generous, most life-affirming thing to do with what you built? There is also the deeply embedded rule that many people absorbed over their lives, sometimes explicitly and sometimes just by cultural osmosis. Do not touch the principal. Live only on what your savings earn. The capital itself is sacred, only the return is spendable. For people with very large portfolios, this rule can make practical sense. The interest and dividends alone may be more than enough to live on, and preserving the principal has genuine value. But for ordinary retirees, people with retirement accounts in the low to middle hundreds of thousands of dollars, trying to fund 20 or 30 years of life. The rule can become a form of self-impoverishment. It can mean spending only the interest on an account that was built, expressly and entirely, to be spent. It can mean living anxiously on returns while the principle that was supposed to provide freedom sits largely untouched, year after year. The question worth asking is not whether caution is ever appropriate. It is, planning for healthcare costs is genuinely wise. Maintaining a buffer for true emergencies is sensible. The math of how long your money needs to last matters, and it deserves serious attention. But there is a difference between thoughtful, calibrated caution and a psychological habit that long ago stopped responding to the actual numbers. There is a difference between a financial decision and an emotional one that has been dressed up in the language of financial discipline. Most people who underspend their retirement accounts are not making a careful calculation that says, given my projected lifespan, my expected healthcare costs, and my current spending rate, I have determined that further restriction is the optimal strategy. They are operating on a feeling. And the feeling says, the number should not go down. The number going down is wrong. The number staying up is safe. Keep it there. Hold on. And that feeling, however understandable, was trained into them by 40 years of saving. And it was never trained out again when the saving was supposed to stop. Here is something that is difficult to hold in your mind but worth holding anyway. The account was always meant to go down. Not recklessly, not carelessly, not without thought or planning or reasonable caution. But the purpose of a retirement account, its entire reason for existing, the reason it was built across decades of discipline and deferred gratification, is to be drawn upon. Slowly, steadily, and over time. The trajectory of the account in retirement is supposed to curve downward. That is not failure. That is not carelessness. That is the plan working exactly as it was designed. A savings account is not a monument. It is not meant to be visited, admired, and preserved in its original form for future generations to inherit intact. It is a reservoir. It was built to hold something for a time, and then to release it. And the releasing, the actual spending of what was saved, is the final act of the whole long effort. It is what all of it was for. There is something worth sitting with in that reframing, because it changes the question entirely. The question is not, how do I avoid watching the number go down? The question is, how do I spend this well? How do I use what I built in a way that is thoughtful, that honors the work that created it, and that actually serves the life I am living now, in the years that are genuinely available to me? Some financial planners use the concept of a spending plan, a document as structured and intentional as the savings plan that preceded it. A spending plan says, here is what I expect to spend each year. Here is how I have budgeted for healthcare and unexpected costs. Here is what I am setting aside for genuine emergencies. And here is what remains to live on freely and without guilt. It turns the act of spending from something reactive and anxious into something deliberate and clear. It brings the same thoughtfulness that made someone a good saver to the equally important work of being a good spender. The same discipline that served so well for 4 decades, the attention, the planning, the willingness to think ahead, can be turned toward spending. And when it is, spending becomes less frightening. It becomes a choice rather than a loss. It becomes something done on purpose, not something that just happens to the account while you look away. But there is also something beyond planning worth considering. Because the anxiety of watching savings go down is not only a planning problem. It is, at some level, a permission problem. Many people are waiting for a signal, from a financial advisor, from a doctor, from a family member, from some authority they trust, that tells them it is acceptable to spend what they built. That they have done enough. That they are allowed. That permission is not coming from outside. It has to come from within. You saved. You were patient over years and decades. You deferred. You made choices, year after year, that required you to trust your future self with the results. You believed that future self would know what to do with what you were building. That future self is now here. And the work now is to honor what was built, not by protecting it in perpetuity, not by leaving it largely untouched as a monument to discipline, but by actually using it. By living, carefully and well, on what was carefully and well constructed. The money was not the point. It was always in service of something else. The trip, the unhurried morning, the time with family that does not have to be rushed, the home that feels like genuine rest, the capacity to be generous with the people you love without calculating whether you can afford it. The money was the means. And means are for using. The account will go down. Month by month and year by year, the number will be smaller. That is right. That is normal. That is exactly as it should be. What matters is not the trajectory of the number. What matters is whether the life it is funding is being lived, with presence, with intention, and without the quiet shame of someone who built something real and then was too afraid to touch it. There is a certain kind of poverty that has nothing to do with how much money you have. It is the poverty of someone who has enough, who knows they have enough, and who still cannot bring themselves to live like they have enough. It is a poverty of permission, a poverty of trust in oneself. You earned the right to spend it. You spent a long time earning that right, and the spending of it, when done thoughtfully and without recklessness, is not a diminishment of what you built. It is the completion of it. # suggested thumbnail text. The wrong direction. Money that won't move. You earned this. The account goes down. You built this to use. # suggested video description. There is a transition that almost no one warns you about. It happens the moment the paycheck stops and you begin living on what you saved. The number in your account starts going down instead of up, and for many people, that feels deeply wrong. Not because they are in financial trouble, but because decades of building and saving never prepared them for the act of spending. In this video, we look at the psychology of retirement spending. Why drawing down savings creates anxiety even for people who saved well. How the shift from pensions to 401ks changed the emotional relationship with retirement money. Why so many retirees live far below what they could afford, and what it truly means to finally use what you spent your life building. The Quiet Briefing, calm, mature reflections on money, aging, and modern life. # fact check notes. Verify when Section 401k of the Revenue Act of 1978 was first widely adopted as a pension replacement through the 1980s and 1990s. Confirm the timeline and the scale of the shift. Verify current percentage of private sector workers with defined benefit pensions versus defined contribution plans, Bureau of Labor Statistics or similar. Verify research on retiree underspending. Check Vanguard How America Saves, T. Rowe Price Retirement Research, or Employee Benefit Research Institute, EBRI. Data on actual spending rates in retirement. Verify whether data supports the claim that many retirees die with more savings than expected, EBRI or similar longitudinal data. Verify median 401k balance at retirement age 65. Use most recent available figures. Verify how many retirees rely primarily on Social Security as their main income source, Social Security Administration data.